So in this video, I'm going to be demonstrating and explaining some of the vulnerabilities in the human perception system and how those are exploited by others.
This isn't real.
What is real? How do you define real? If you're talking about what you can feel, what you can smell, what you can taste and see, then real is simply electrical signals interpreted by your brain.
Everything from the feeling of stubbing your toe to an orgasm, to the smell of fresh pine versus the smell of a decomposing body. Everything that anyone has ever experienced has all been a result of about 120 millivolt variance in our neurons. Now, before I explain to you how and why this conscious perception system functions in the way it is and how it's vulnerable and open to being exploited, it's going to help if you can see some of the vulnerabilities first, so that way it's a little bit more palatable. Now, quick little examples coming up, and you're going to see two inverted faces. Try and see what looks off about those faces and if that remains the same or changes when the pictures are right side up. You're also going to hear audio playing in the background, and you're going to see two words at the top of the screen. You will recognize that whichever one you are reading or even thinking at the time the audio plays will be what you hear. So now for the blind spot, you're going to see a plus and a circle. What you do is you place one hand over one eye, so the right hand over your right eye. Using your left eye, you look at the circle, which should be on the right side. When you're focused in on it and you can still see the plus sign in your periphery, as you move it in and out, there should be a point at which you'll see that the plus sign completely disappears while the circle is still there and it just fills in with white. I hope it makes it a little bit more intuitive now that you've seen it with your own eyes. When I say things like colors don't exist, the solids that we see are only represented that way because we interact with them as if they were solids, but in reality, they are mostly empty space. So the big difference between the way in which humans develop our visual perception system and the way in which we're trying to develop it for AI is that with AI, we start off with these high resolution 2D images and just tons of them, trying to categorize them based on similarities and differences. Whereas for us, we start off with a very, very low representation of everything. Basically something where one model kind of seems like it should fit for everything up until the moment where you actually try to use it and it doesn't match up. So basically, like the first time you might see a cat and think that it's a dog because you've only seen dogs before, but then you start to notice that it behaves suspiciously different than any other dog. And so now, instead of categorizing it as this is this breed of cat with all the other cats and short hair, long hair, and all that nonsense, you then look at this four-legged creature and you look at yourself and you think, well, the tail maybe acts a little differently, the face is a little different, and it moves differently. And these are just some really low-resolution ways in which you can differentiate this animal versus another one. So something that I've already mentioned before somewhere along the lines is that if they wanted to help decrease the amount of time and effort it took to recognize an object, they should add jerk and acceleration equations to it. You play a 2-minute video showing what a dog can do and how they handle their body weight and things like that, and then you can literally make profiles based on acceleration and jerk, which is going to be very consistent along certain parameters, and they're going to be very variable amongst others, making it much more simple than to try and figure out what something is just based off of millions of pixels in one area or another. But regardless, it is this point in time in our development that we start to develop our preferences, our likes and our dislikes, what's good and what's bad. And all of this is based and structured around our beliefs. You believe that something is good or something is bad, and what you believe controls what you will do. What you do will affect your results, and your results will affect what you believe. Now, belief is extremely variable because culture is extremely variable dependent on the geography in which you were born. For example, there's the Dobu tribe. They trade in magic and spells and wish harm upon those closest to them because that's going to bring crops and things of that nature. There's another group that believes it's best to blow themselves up and take innocent lives with them. And there's another group that believes if you commit suicide because you shamed your family, that might be a reasonable thing. There is also another group of people who talk to someone who isn't there, and when they do something wrong, they believe that if they ask this person for forgiveness, that they will be forgiven and all is well in the world. Although the reality we live in may vary from group to group, it all exists for the same purpose. The reason why we have this mental model is so that way we can label information and things as good or bad. The reason why we need to label things as good or bad is so that way we know whether or not to act or not to act, to go or not to go. There was an experiment performed on a patient that had short-term memory loss where a doctor went to go shake the patient's hand and had a thumbtack on the hand so it pricked the patient. Now, when he went to go repeat this experiment, the patient, for whatever reason, pulled the hand back. And then when the doctor asked him why, he said that was because he was a germaphobe. This is the confabulation, the story that we tell ourselves to justify and understand why we do the things we do. This is the same thing that happened with the Germans, right, when Hitler took over. A whole bunch of people who were just normal, innocent people, under the belief that they were doing the right thing, completely picked up and changed their lives and started murdering people. And because our mental model is built around affective valence, basically improving our ability to determine whether or not something is good or bad at first glance, is extremely easy to manipulate. All one has to do is introduce a new unknown variable. If that unknown variable is labeled with having bad actions or bad outcomes, then now you can then use this unknown, imaginary, if it will be, a bad thing or person to associate with either another bad person or thing, and you can then now generate hate towards something that was already in this existence of their mental model because it is associated with this new unknown bad thing. You can also generate action by creating a solution. Whether or not that solution is as fabricated as the problem was is irrelevant. At the end of the day, if people are afraid and they see something bad and you present them with a solution, they will act on that solution because they believe that it is the right thing to do. I'm going to start explaining some of the reasons why things are the way they are, as well as some of the benefits to these things. But first, if you're still watching, I'd appreciate it if you like, share, and subscribe because it really does help. Now, the first part is just the belief aspect. Why do we believe? Why do we need to believe as humans? Well, because just to survive in nature, we don't really have much else but our intelligence, our knowledge, and our knowledge is greatest when we combine it as a group. There is no one person who knows everything, and if anything, when it comes down to survival, we don't have any sort of physical superiority. If anything, we're kind of physically lacking. And so we're dependent upon what we know, and what we know is vastly greater when we're willing to listen to what others have to say and accept their personal experience and beliefs as our own until we have some new evidence that supersedes it. So now, what most people in the medical field don't consider is that the optic blind spot, the optic nerve, isn't a bug. It's actually necessary. If you're going to try and focus in on an object at any distance, these eyes have to line up so perfectly. And what happens when one eye is slightly off a target? Well, your whole image is going to be blurred. And then how do you correct for that? Well, who knows? Like you have anywhere that you can go. Like, how do you correct for that? So what you do is when you have two blind spots, right? Not only is it giving you something to aim at, right? Because this eye here isn't going to really be able to see what's here. Just like this eye can't see what's there. But when they start to overlap, they both have the ability to basically fill in these blind spots, and you can do so with respect to one another. And so, as this one starts to fill in the blind spot partially, this one's simultaneously being filled in. It's almost like locking on. And what's better is that when you get further out, the blind spot will actually take up a larger amount of space, whereas what you're focusing on becomes more and more difficult to focus on because the slight changes in angles have a much more drastic effect. Any slight little off, little angle will end up making a huge difference as to where your lens actually lines up. And so by having these blind spot get larger, now as this eye starts to fill in that gap and starts to fill in, and this one starts to fill in that one, it gives the eye something to focus on, to line the image up. That isn't just because this point here could be anything. You're looking at an object, but is this eye could be focused here on this part, this eye could be focused here on this part. Now your image is blurred, but you don't really know that it's blurred because you don't have any reference. Like a camera, right? When that has focus, when you touch your phone and it focuses, what it does is it continually adjusts the lens, which increases the sharpness of the image right up until the image gets a little bit blurrier than it was going before, and then it goes back one. Now, there's a couple other methods where they'll detect a distance and do a few other things, but that's how it happens for the most part. So without these blind spots, I just can't really imagine how we would be able to lock onto something with such clear focus at such a distance, especially as it's moving, because now you have two eyes that are trying to track. And so instead of trying to track this little point, they can kind of just keep the blind spots in each other's periphery and maintain that. I know that's not something that we necessarily think about because our eyes are mostly being manipulated by the autonomic nervous system, so we don't have to deal with a lot of that. I felt like one more visual representation might help. If you imagine each of our eyes are taking two different pictures, right? And these dots are the center of focus. Now these are going to be the blind spots. Now imagine you're trying to line up your center of focus, these little dots which don't actually exist. You're trying to line these two up, right? With no real perspective because there's no laser pointer. But you see as this vision starts to encroach upon the blind spot, it starts to basically fill in that part of the image. And so now all you're doing is you're lining up two blind spots and you're filling them in to get yourself a central point much quicker than if you were just to try and do it free willy. So while I covered a lot more about psychology here and some about the perception system, you have to understand that before you can learn about time and space, you have to understand how we perceive everything from time and space. To understand the human perception system, you have to also understand the psychology that goes along with it, which is why this is the second part, and there will most likely be a third part as well.